I never imagined that a pile of construction debris could steal a future I'd spent 15 years building toward. But that's exactly what happened. And the strangest part is that the people responsible weren't criminals or strangers passing through town. They were my own neighborhood association. The same folks who loved sending newsletters about flower beds and mailbox colors while pretending they cared about community. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 39 years old. And until all this happened, I believed that following the rules eventually paid off, though I have to admit life has a funny way of testing that belief when you least expect it. The story really starts on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the suburbs outside Mesa, Arizona, when the sun was baking the sidewalks so hard you could almost smell the concrete heating up. I had just finished reviewing structural drawings for a commercial renovation project and drove home with the kind of nervous excitement that only comes when your career is about to change forever. After months of interviews and technical assessments, I was entering the final stage for a senior engineering position that would nearly double my opportunities and finally let me stop worrying every time my truck needed repairs or my insurance bill arrived. My friends joked that I already had one foot in the new office, and honestly, I believed them. Then I turned into my driveway and saw bright orange barricades stretching across the accessibility ramp leading from my front porch to the driveway. At first, I figured someone had parked equipment there for an hour or two, but as I got closer, I saw piles of broken concrete, twisted rebar, stacks of lumber, and several giant dumpsters sitting exactly where my only accessible route should have been. I sat in my truck for a full minute just staring because sometimes your brain refuses to accept what your eyes are seeing. Finally, I climbed out and asked one of the workers, "Hey, how long is this stuff going to be here?" The guy shrugged without even looking at me and said, "We're just following orders from the HOA." Following orders. Those two words would echo in my head for weeks. I made a dozen phone calls before someone at the management office finally answered, and her voice sounded like she'd rather be anywhere else. I explained that the blocked access meant I couldn't safely get in and out of my property the way it was designed, and that I had several critical interviews coming up. She interrupted before I finished. "It's a temporary improvement project." I asked how temporary. She said, "Probably 6 to 8 weeks." I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. 6 to 8 weeks? I told her that wasn't an inconvenience. It was a disaster. I had commitments, appointments, meetings that could change my life. There was a pause. Then she sighed like I was wasting her afternoon and said, "Sir, we can't make special accommodations every time someone has a personal story." I answered, "This isn't a personal story. It's my legal access." She replied, "Well, everyone thinks their situation is unique." Then the line went dead. I called back twice and reached voicemail both times. That evening, I sat on my porch watching neighbors walk dogs and kids ride bicycles while I stared at the blocked ramp like it was a wall separating two different versions of my life. One where everything I'd worked for was within reach, and another where I was trapped by people who didn't even know my name. My phone buzzed with an email confirming the first interview time for Thursday morning, and instead of feeling excited, I felt sick. I spent hours trying to find alternatives, asking contractors if they could temporarily clear a path, calling transportation services, even considering whether I could somehow climb over the debris without risking injury. Every option failed. Around sunset, my next-door neighbor stepped outside carrying a watering can and glanced toward my porch. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, a retired woman with silver hair, sharp eyes, and the calm posture of someone who never rushed because she never had to. Most people simply knew her as the quiet widow who loved gardening. But a few years earlier, I'd helped her solve a structural nightmare after dishonest contractors insisted her historic home needed demolition. I spent evenings reviewing the foundation plans without charging her a dime because I hated seeing good people taken advantage of. She had hugged me afterward and said, "If life ever puts you in a corner, Ethan, I hope you'll let me return the favor." At the time, I smiled and said she didn't owe me anything. Sitting there that evening, staring at the barricades while she slowly looked from the debris back to my face, I realized life had quietly led me into that very corner, and I had no idea that the conversation about to happen would change not only my future, but the future of everyone running that homeowners association. The next morning, Margaret knocked on my door before 8, still wearing gardening gloves and carrying a plain leather folder that looked older than both of us. She stepped onto the porch, looked at the barricades one more time, and asked a question so simple it caught me off guard. "Did you document everything?" Luckily, engineers have a habit of saving paperwork the way grandmothers save recipes. I showed her photographs with timestamps, emails from the management company, copies of neighborhood notices, and even a rough sketch I had made showing how the construction completely eliminated my accessible route. She flipped through every page without saying much, occasionally nodding to herself. Finally, she looked at me and said, "You missed one thing." I frowned. "What?" She tapped the folder and answered, "You documented what they did. Now we're going to document why they kept doing it." That afternoon, she suggested we simply watch. No angry confrontation, no shouting, no dramatic speeches. Just observe. For 3 days, we sat on my porch at different hours, and every time someone from the HOA or the contractor came by, Margaret quietly wrote notes. A delivery driver asked if he could move a few cones to bring a package closer to my door. A supervisor told him no because the association wanted the area completely closed. An elderly neighbor mentioned that several residents had complained about the mess. Another worker admitted they could have created a temporary pathway with plywood and portable railings, but had been instructed not to change anything until the project was finished. "Interesting," Margaret whispered. "Very interesting." Meanwhile, my life continued falling apart one appointment at a time. Thursday's interview came and went. I joined the video call from my living room hoping the company would understand, but halfway through the conversation, they asked whether I could visit the site the following day. I explained the situation honestly. The hiring manager looked sympathetic, but sympathy does not build bridges. "We'll do our best to accommodate," he said, though I could already hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. The second interview required an in-person engineering assessment involving field measurements. I missed it completely. 2 days later, I received a polite email thanking me for my time and wishing me success in future opportunities. It was written with such professional kindness that it somehow hurt more than if they had simply rejected me. I walked into my kitchen, stared at the coffee maker for several minutes, and realized I hadn't actually made coffee. I was holding an empty mug. That's what stress does. It steals ordinary moments first. A week later, I finally marched into the HOA office. The receptionist barely looked up. The property manager, whose name was Denise Holloway, invited me into her office with the same enthusiasm people reserve for tax audits. Her walls were covered with certificates about community leadership and excellence in neighborhood management. I almost laughed at the irony. I placed photographs on her desk and said, "This has gone far beyond temporary inconvenience. I lost a career opportunity because of this." She leaned back and folded her arms. "Construction is disruptive. Everyone deals with it." I answered, "Everyone isn't being blocked from their only accessible entrance." She shrugged. "The board approved the project." I asked, "Did the board approve violating accessibility standards too?" She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind people wear when they think authority belongs to them forever. "Mr. Carter, threatening legal language doesn't intimidate us. We've handled complaints before." I gathered my papers and stood up. "I'm not trying to intimidate anyone." She replied, "Good. Because it won't work." As I reached the door, she added, "Some people spend more time looking for exceptions than solutions." That sentence followed me all the way home. Margaret listened without interrupting while I repeated every word. When I finished, she quietly removed her gardening gloves and placed them on the table. "Now we know the motivation," she said. "This isn't about construction. It's about control." I asked what she meant. She explained that organizations often become careless when nobody challenges them. They start believing procedures matter more than people, then eventually convince themselves they are above accountability. She opened the leather folder and revealed documents I hadn't noticed before. Old planning approvals, county maps, utility easement records, building permits dating back years. "Where did you get all these?" I asked. She smiled. "Public records are wonderful bedtime reading." Over the next several days, my quiet neighbor transformed into someone I barely recognized. She visited county offices, spoke with inspectors, requested archived files, and called attorneys she hadn't spoken to since retirement. Every evening, she returned with another stack of papers. One night, she spread them across my dining table until the wood surface disappeared. "Look here," she said, pointing to a drainage easement running through common property. "Now compare that with this aerial photo." I looked carefully. "Wait, that's the HOA president's expanded garage." Margaret nodded. "Exactly." She pulled another document forward. and this storage building behind the clubhouse exceeds approved dimensions. Another page revealed fences built beyond property lines. Another identified retaining walls lacking required inspections. Suddenly, the blocked ramp wasn't an isolated event anymore. It was part of a culture where rules applied to residents, but somehow stopped at the boardroom door. 2 mornings later, she asked me to put on a clean shirt and meet her downtown. We entered a courthouse that smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. I assumed she was introducing me to an attorney. Instead, she walked confidently through security, greeted several employees by first name, and disappeared into a hallway before returning with a man carrying a briefcase. "Ethan," she said calmly, "I'd like you to meet Richard Hale. He's going to help prepare the filings." I looked from him to her in confusion. "How did you arrange all this so quickly?" Richard chuckled. "When Margaret calls, people answer." During the meeting, they explained that the case would not revolve around my frustration alone. It would focus on documented obstruction, repeated notice, refusal to provide reasonable alternatives, and evidence suggesting selective enforcement. Every email, every photograph, every dismissive statement suddenly became another brick in a wall the HOA had unknowingly built around itself. Before leaving, Margaret handed me a pen. "Read carefully and sign only if everything is accurate." I signed. She closed the folder and said something I'll never forget. "People often think justice arrives like lightning. Most of the time it arrives disguised as paperwork." On the drive home, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Denise Holloway from the HOA office. I answered. Her tone was unusually cheerful. "Mr. Carter, we've been reviewing the schedule, and we might be able to clear part of the access next week." I looked over at Margaret, who raised one eyebrow as if she already knew the conversation before it happened. I asked Denise, "What changed?" There was a pause. Then she replied, "Let's just say we've received some inquiries." Margaret smiled without saying a word and stared out the window toward the courthouse behind us while I realized that somewhere, somehow, the people who had spent weeks ignoring me had finally begun to understand that the story they thought was over had actually just begun. By the following Monday, the mood inside the neighborhood had changed so dramatically that even people who normally avoided gossip were standing at their mailboxes pretending to collect letters while watching county vehicles roll through the entrance. White trucks parked along the curb, inspectors stepped out carrying clipboards and cameras, and for the first time since this whole mess began, nobody from the HOA looked confident. Denise spotted me from across the street and started walking over with the fastest smile I'd ever seen on her face. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I think we've had a misunderstanding. We'd like to work together to resolve this." A week earlier, she couldn't end our conversation fast enough, but now every sentence sounded polished and careful. I looked at the barricades that had trapped me for weeks and asked, was it a misunderstanding when I called? Or when I emailed? Or when I told you I was losing a career opportunity? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. At that moment, another inspector called for the HOA president to come outside. The man who had spent years lecturing neighbors about lawn height and garbage can suddenly look like a student called to the principal's office. Over the next several days, the inspectors kept returning. They measured structures, reviewed permits, checked drainage plans, and compared old records with current construction. Every afternoon, another rumor spread through the neighborhood. Someone said a retaining wall had never been approved. Someone else heard that a common area fence crossed into a utility easement. Then people discovered that several board members had quietly received exceptions for projects that ordinary homeowners would never have been allowed to build. The same organization that insisted rules were sacred had apparently treated those rules like optional suggestions whenever its own leadership benefited. Margaret remained as calm as ever. She never celebrated, never mocked anyone, never even raised her voice. One evening, I thanked her for everything she had done and admitted that I still regretted losing the engineering position. She looked at me and said, "A closed door hurts less when you stop staring at it and notice the hallway that's opening." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. 2 days later, I did. A regional engineering firm that had heard about my previous interviews called unexpectedly. One of their senior managers had worked with an architect who knew my reputation and asked whether I would be interested in meeting. I almost laughed because after everything that had happened, I had stopped expecting good news. The interview lasted less than an hour. Instead of questioning my abilities, they asked about my leadership style, my long-term goals, and the accessibility projects I cared about. A week later, they offered me a position with better compensation, stronger benefits, and more responsibility than the job I thought I had lost forever. Meanwhile, the HOA's problems only grew larger. Legal expenses climbed. Insurance carriers refused to absorb several claims. Homeowners demanded emergency meetings, and board members who once acted untouchable suddenly resigned one after another. During the final settlement discussions, the association agreed to cover the costs connected to restoring my access, compensate me for documented losses, and issue a formal written acknowledgement that the situation should have been handled differently from the beginning. More importantly, new oversight procedures were imposed so that future construction affecting accessibility or public access would face far stricter review before approval. The barricades disappeared within hours. Watching workers remove the last cone felt strangely emotional. It wasn't just concrete and lumber being hauled away. It was weeks of frustration, helplessness, and being treated like my voice didn't matter. The first time I rolled down that clear pathway again, the morning sun hit the fresh pavement, and for a second I stopped halfway, just to look back at the house. Margaret was watering her flowers like always. She noticed me, lifted the watering can in a little salute, and smiled. No dramatic speech, no victory dance, just a quiet reminder that decency sometimes wins because someone is willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of standing up for another person. Looking back now, I don't think the biggest lesson was that an HOA can overstep or that paperwork can defeat arrogance. The biggest lesson was that power without empathy eventually collapses under its own weight. The people running that board believed they were protecting standards, but somewhere along the way they forgot they were supposed to be serving neighbors. I still drive through that community from time to time, and every visit reminds me how quickly confidence can turn into accountability when ordinary people refuse to accept being ignored. So here's what I want to ask you. If you were in my position, would you have accepted an apology the moment they finally offered one? Or would you have kept pushing until the system changed for everyone? Let me know where you stand in the comments, because stories like this are rarely just about one driveway or one neighborhood. They're about how much power any community should have over the people who call it home. And if you believe fairness should never depend on who has the loudest voice, share this story, subscribe to the channel, and join the conversation. Because the most interesting part isn't what happened to me, it's what you think should have happened next.